The thundering explosion that trembled through the ancient stone structure shook her awake to find bits of dust and plaster crumbling from the ceiling, covering her bed. This city was used to war, and it wasn't the first time the fighting woke her from her sleep. But the noise was different tonight, closer, and absent of the warning sirens that usually preceded the bombings. She opened her eyes, listening to the screams coming from the hallway, while a staccato beat of automatic weapons fire sounded from the courtyard beyond her chamber window. Her door burst open and a small man pressed into her modestly furnished room. Ignoring pleasantries, he rushed to the bedside and grabbed her by the wrist, trying to pull her from the bed. She recognized the man as Ishmael, one of the guards assigned by the state to guard the monastery. Normally quiet and reserved, tonight the man's eyes were filled with fright and panic.
"Sister Sarah, please come quickly,"
he shouted. Sarah pulled her arm away, lifting the bedspread to cover herself.
"How dare you enter my chamber like—" "Excuse me, sister, there is no—"
Another blast of weapons fire interrupted him. He dropped her wrist and ran to the window. For the first time, she noticed the man's rifle. He was armed. Even though in a war zone, she'd never seen a weapon inside the monastery grounds.
"Ishmael, weapons are not allowed inside the church. What's happening?"
He turned away from the window, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. He looked at her in despair.
"God forgive me, sister." "For what, Ishmael?"
Sarah scrambled from the bed, searching for her clothing in the dark. Ishmael stepped back from the window and ran to the door, stopping to look back at her a final time. She could read the horror on his face as his lip quivered and his voice cracked.
"Forgive me, sister. There is no time. May Allah protect you."
Ishmael slammed the chamber door shut behind him. Then she heard the lock tumble and click home.
"No!"
she shouted, knowing that the doors of the monastery were all locked and unlocked with ancient skeleton keys. Sarah looked at the hook next to the door and noticed her room key was missing. Ishmael must have swiped it and locked her into the chamber room. Lights flashed from outside her window. The weapons fire and screaming grew louder. She heard the shouting of men's voices and the thud of their boots stomping through corridors of the building. Doors were kicked in, and women screamed as they were dragged from their chamber rooms. Bursts of weapons fire followed a terrified wailing from the sisters of the monastery. The heavy boots moved along the hallway and stopped just at the other side of her door. Her heart raced in crippling fear as the handle rattled. Sarah cowered to the farthest corner of her room and shielded her face. A man pounded at the door, shouting instructions in a language and dialect she didn't understand. Then the lock and handle exploded with a deafening sound of rifle fire. Before she could look away, the destroyed door was kicked in and men rushed forward. Filthy men, stinking of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke. They had long beards and wore black clothing under military vests heaving with equipment. A man grabbed at her and pulled her forward. She struggled helplessly to resist and looked into the man's soulless eyes. He smiled back with a jagged grin and swung a closed fist that caught her square in the front of her teeth. She tasted the blood and felt the pain reverberate through her body, the whiplash straining her neck and causing her muscles to go slack. More men rushed in and grabbed at her. They tore at her nightgown, and Sarah felt the cold air hit her bare flesh. The men pulled her in every direction, then dragged her limp, nearly naked body through the hallways. Her mind lulled as she passed over cold stone floors, down ancient staircases, and finally into a courtyard, where she was dropped heavily to the ground. She tasted the dirt as her face hit the crushed gravel. The spinning world finally settled, her vision focusing on a tall block wall. Other women surrounded her, whimpering and crying, some trembling with fear. The gunfire faded, then halted. The women clustered together, trying to find safety in their closeness. Sarah brought a finger to her lip and quickly pulled away from the sting of her open cut. Her front teeth were loose from the man's blow. She tried to look beyond her group to survey the surroundings. They were in the outer yard of the monastery, a little used place where vehicles were kept and the grounds were patrolled by armed guards.